So, as I'm sure you know and are well aware, Republican led states in the South are embarking on a project affirmed by the Supreme Court. We've been talking a lot about the Supreme Court over the last week. A project to destroy, obliterate the majority minority districts they have in their states. This would have the effect of more or less wiping out Black representation in Congress throughout much of the South. If these efforts to implement the Supreme Court's ruling in Calais v. Louisiana and redistrict are successful. I wrote about this in my column this week. I'll provide that column to you on this page next week as a video. But I wrote about this in my column this week that if you just look at Black representation in the federal legislature, before 1965, there's a smattering of representation, 6 members, not in the South, nowhere in the South. There's hardly any Black elected office holders in the South. By 1975, 10 years after the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, we have 17 Black members of Congress. In 1985, the 20-year mark, that is just about 20. It's not until after 1990 that you start to get numbers in the 30s, 40s, and by the 2010s, 50s, and 60s, roughly in line, percentage-wise, with the Black portion of the overall population. And the reason why it takes so long is basically because the extremely racially polarized nature of voting in the South is such that if Black voters are trying to elect a Black lawmaker in most of the South, that person is just not really going to get elected. That's how stark the racial polarization in voting is, especially in those states where Black Americans represent a large portion of the population, a third of the population in Louisiana, a quarter of the population in Alabama, around 40 to 45% of the population in Mississippi. Now, I happen to think that there's actually a pretty decent chance that Democrats may respond to this should they get power. I say that for a couple reasons. And I know there's a lot of skepticism about the Democratic Party's willingness to do anything, but I think there are decent reasons to think that there will be a response to these efforts to destroy Black representation in the South. First and foremost, these members who will lose their seats are African American. They are typically members with a good deal of seniority, a lot of support, a base of power, and they're vocal. They're going to want the National Party to do something about this once it has federal power again. Additionally, this really does threaten to undermine Black political participation in general, because Calais also allows states to play this game at the state legislative level. And if you're going to be removing Black representation, you may well just begin to erode the desire of Black Americans, Black voters, to participate in the process at all. And this really threatens the entire Democratic Party. The Democratic Party really does depend on Black Americans. They're a key constituency for the party at large. And I think that combination of internal demands by Black lawmakers and their allies, as well as just sort of a straightforward analysis of the electoral situation, may well push Democrats to try to do something about this when they have federal power again, to try to find some way to end partisan gerrymandering or restructure how we do redistricting such that you can't pull these shenanigans anymore. A straightforward response to the Supreme Court's decision in Calais. And it is with that in mind that it's worth thinking about the legal basis for how you might go after partisan gerrymandering, both at the federal level and the state level, because any such piece of legislation is going to be challenged and the Supreme Court may well weigh on it. So you have to think about what you want to do to get ahead of the Supreme Court. And although one response is to say, well, first you pack the court, then you do this, I think it's still worthwhile to think seriously about the legal avenues you would take, because you still need to craft the law, irrespective of what the court looks like. So there are a few things to remember. The first thing is that the Constitution gives Congress unqualified authority over the conduct of federal elections. States do set the time and manner of elections, but if Congress wants to get involved, it can. That's the constitutional basis for the Voting Rights Act, that and the 15th Amendment. Congressional authority to shape elections does not reach down to the state level, so state legislative races are kind of out of the hands of Congress, but oftentimes federal regulations of federal elections has a habit of just trickling down to state elections. States don't want to have to duplicate processes, right? They want to have a single process. Nonetheless, you still probably want to have some ability on part of Congress to be able to shape state election rules. The other thing to know is that the Supreme Court has stated in Rucho v. Common Cause that partisan gerrymandering is outside of its remit. Whether or not it's constitutional, and in that decision, the court suggested that it might not be. In this most recent one, the court seems to treat it as a legitimate aim of state governments, whatever they think. The court said in Rucho that regardless of the constitutional status, the judiciary has no say in handling it, has no say in dealing with it. It's non-judiciable. Remember that. The Supreme Court says that partisan gerrymandering is non-judiciable. It's out of their hands. It's purely a political concern. And the third thing to remember is that under Article 3, Section 2, which is Article 3 deals with the courts, Section 2 describes that court's original jurisdiction and also states that Congress has the ability to shape that court's appeals jurisdiction. And it's generally recognized that Congress could do what's called jurisdiction stripping. It can say in the passage of a bill that, oh, this will not go to the Supreme Court for a final appeal. It can't. The Supreme Court, it is off limits for the court to handle. I think if you line these things up, you have actually a pretty good way of approaching legislation to ban partisan gerrymandering. Oh, I forgot there's one other thing that's important to mention. Article 4 contains something called the Guarantee Clause. And the Guarantee Clause simply states that all states are guaranteed a Republican form of government. The court has also said that this is non-judiciable, that it has no take on this. This has to be determined by the political branches. I think when you line all this up together, you have a pretty good path for how to approach these things. Using Congress's power under Article 1 and using the guarantee of a Republican form of government, which in this world Congress could easily define as a form of government in which people can elect the representatives of their choosing, in which one person is roughly equal to one vote, basic lowercase d democratic standards. Under both Congress's constitutional authority to regulate federal elections and the Guarantee Clause, Congress can then reach into states and say, we are no longer going to have partisan redistricting, partisan gerrymandering is outlawed, and this is just if you want something that's largely in line with the current way of doing elections, meaning single member districts, we are going to use an algorithm based around compactness in order to draw districts. And so the goal will be for districts to be as sort of compact and continuous as possible. Discrete communities, right? No drawing, crazy lines and whatnot. In addition to using Article 1 and the Guarantee Clause to go about this, that's your constitutional authority, you also reference the court's own decisions when it comes to its hands-off approach to both partisan gerrymandering and the definition of a Republican form of government. You say in the bill, the court has said that this is non-judiciable, and so we are using our authority as outlined by the court to offer definitions here and to take an approach here. This doesn't eliminate the chance that the court will practice shenanigans. It almost certainly will. But I think it puts you on some pretty firm political grounding to say, we're just acting in a way the court has more or less freed us to do. And lastly, you can engage in some jurisdiction stripping. You can say, hey, the court can't handle this. Because the court has in fact said that it's non-judiciable, we're saying that you can't appeal this to the Supreme Court. It is out of their hands. You probably have to have some kind of judicial remedy involved here, and you can figure that out. I'm not going to try to figure that out on camera right now, but you can figure that out. But that judicial remedy does not have to involve the Supreme Court. You could even Congress could create a set of courts whose main purpose is to adjudicate questions when it comes to redistricting under this new scheme. Now, if I were thinking in blue sky terms, like the sky's the limit, you can do whatever you want. What you'd want is to get rid of single member districts altogether. What you'd want is to double the size of the House, introduce multi-member districts, and introduce proportional representation. That solves the problem of gerrymandering. It solves the problem of partisan redistricting. It solves all these problems. It solves the problem of representation for minority groups. It solves the problem. But in the absence of political will to do that, and to accomplish that, you would need like a years long political effort, right? Like an actual movement to make this a possible thing, because you'd be asking whichever party spearheaded it to fundamentally transform itself and to introduce competitors, right? Like, this should be a major sea change in American electoral history. So, in the absence of that, and if you're just saying we're going to have our single member districts, we're going to have the basic structure of elections down, but we're going to try to make the districting more fair, I think this is how you'd go about it, and this is the legal basis that you would use. I hope you found this interesting, and I'll see you next time.